My name is Sofia Espinosa. I'm a land and water tenure expert, and I'm the coordinator of the KnoWat project in Thailand. And today I'm very pleased to launch this new session with the key findings of the water tenure assessment in Sri Lanka by our colleague and friend Anandalal Nanayakkara, who is an environmental lawyer. As I mentioned, please some introduction before we start the session. Please note that this session is being recorded. Please keep your mics muted. And if you have any technical issue, if you cannot hear or you cannot see the screen, please contact our colleague Sofia Ramirez. We encourage you to use the chat box if you want to engage in discussion or you want to share some links. But regarding the questions to the presentation today, we kindly ask you to use the Q&A box that you have. So thank you. I see people is still connecting. So I'm going to welcome you to this second Water Tenure Monday series. As you know, we're building on the success of the series organized in 2021-2022 that engaged over 1,800 participants and more than 1,400 FAO colleagues. This new series is focused in Asia and the Pacific as part of the roadmap towards the regional dialogue on water tenure for the region. So during this session and over the coming weeks, we will share country cases, tools, and experiences that have strengthened the understanding of what is water tenure and its role in a sustainable and more equitable access to water. Since, and as you know, many of the smallholders, farmers, and fisher folks are sometimes the most affected during water crisis, and many of those rely on customary water tenure practices that are not always formally recognized, making it essential to understand today how these rights are legally defined, socially recognized, and implemented in practice. And today we're going to hear some of these examples in Sri Lanka as you know, this is part of the initiative and the efforts of FAO since 2022 to support COAG's recommendation to engage in a global dialogue on water tenure and to develop principles on responsible governance of water tenure. So with this, today we will see how water tenure has been addressed and studied, what is the link with other resources, and how the Asia and the Pacific experience can contribute to this dialogue on water tenure. And we will learn from the lessons of the countries to guide us for the upcoming regional dialogue on May 2026. With this in mind, please, I'm very pleased to give the floor to our colleague and friend Anandalal, who is an attorney in law with over 30 years of experience in legal, policy, and institutional consulting, not only in Sri Lanka, but also in other countries in the region, such as Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Pakistan, Bhutan, and more. So with this introduction, I'm really happy to pass the floor to Anand for his presentation. Anand, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia, and good day to everyone. With all the different time zones, I wouldn't know how to greet you. It's afternoon here. When we get into the Sri Lankan example, let me get the presentation on. So before we get into the water tenure aspects, we did a fairly detailed study on through FAO on the water tenure aspects in Sri Lanka. And before we get into that, let me quickly go through the water resources scenario in Sri Lanka, which is Sri Lanka is actually a country of diversity. And that's also an invitation to all of you all to try and visit us whenever possible. And that diversity extends to water resources as well as the formal and informal framework that regulates this resource. So Sri Lanka being an island, the central hill country, there are 103 principal rivers that radiate from the central hill country, flowing down to the ocean. And so what you see are the river basins, which are all the boundaries of which are the river systems. And the interesting factor is that even though, so as an island, it is dependent for its principal source of water is rainwater, which then gets into the groundwater and feeds the rivers and so on. But the country doesn't have large scale lakes, natural lakes to retain this substantial rainfall. So historically, you find if you look at the map that you see to your right, the white area is what's generally called the wet zone because it gets a decent amount of rainfall. But the blue dotted areas are actually the dry zone. And then there are a couple of arid zones also. The dry zones are dotted with all these blue dots that you see are artificial reservoirs historically called tanks. And these artificial reservoirs have been built from about the 4th century BC. So there's about 14,000 artificial reservoirs here, which contain the rainwater and hold it for paddy cultivation purposes. So when you look at Sri Lankan scenario, the natural water resources and the artificial water resources take equal significance and equal prominence. These being coming from about the 4th century BC, these are some of them are in various states of disrepair and need to be updated, need to be maintained, need renovation work. And the restoration has started from the 1920s, but as you would understand, restoring all these would be a huge exercise. So not all of them are in proper working order, but there are these ancient tanks which still supply water for irrigation purposes. And the country gained independence in 1948 from the British. Prior to that, there were the Dutch, and Dutch, as you know, were famous for their canal making skills. And before that, there were the Portuguese. Now, historically, with this reservoir system, as you would expect, there were also rules that regulated how the water and as well as irrigation and cultivation took place. Now, one of the well recorded ones is what's called the KnoWat pillar inscription, and these are pillar inscriptions in stone, believed to be by during the period of this King Dapula, which would now it's 924 to 935, which would make it a little over 1,000 years old. And the pillar inscription is the village was given over to a high military official for his revenue, and perhaps because it was given to an individual for his maintenance and sustenance, the rules regulating cultivation and irrigation were publicly proclaimed and set out there in stone, literally in stone, so that you could then everybody could see what the guidelines were. So there are offenses related to cultivation, terms of penalties for specific offenses, and if there was some objection taken to the imposition of a fine, say that it is excessive and so on, the villagers who were the cultivators could get together. You could go to them and ask them for some leniency in the penalty, and it was a collective decision that was taken. So the system had developed a very robust system of irrigation management had developed during this time. if you when the traditional system is looked at, kind of a cross section would be that the laws were largely customary in nature. Of course, the word customary has to be there is debate as to whether customary meant that it was very loose, but it appears that it wasn't as loose as we would think in the case of customary today. Sharp distinctions were not drawn between the law and morality. And of course, the mid-19th century irrigation practices, which are fairly well documented, show that there was local level management, particularly in the local level reservoirs. There was, of course, shared effort or combined exertion of the shareholders. Responsibility was joint. Access to water was contingent on meeting your obligations. You could not use the water so as it would be detrimental to the remaining fields, the fields of others. Generally, the field that was furthest from the water source would be plowed first and so on, getting closer and closer, since security of water was there for those that were the closest. And of course, there were sanctions for violation of this agreed code. And also, it would appear that there was a robust system of revenue. Records were maintained, and taxation also was there. One of the important things of this kind of system is that the local level irrigation work was less susceptible to political and socio-economic change than the large-scale centrally managed works, because obviously decision was taken at the local level itself. These laws, of course, these laws or customs or whatever, could be disregarded in the event of extraordinary circumstances. Now, this is what is recorded here as a Bethma practice. This is a practice that you find in other countries also. When there's a shortage of water, the area that could be cultivated with the remaining water would be divided up between the farmers according to their land holding, and it would be cultivated by them. Of course, the cultivation also was a combined effort where everybody contributed in effort. This is when we started doing this FAO study on land tenure. In order to get a better understanding, I try to get this the schematic into one sheet of paper, which I will try to take you through. And this is the formal law, how the formal law sees the water resources. So we have surface water, which then is divided into natural water bodies and artificial water bodies, as I showed you initially. Artificial water bodies are also as significant as the natural water bodies in Sri Lanka. And this water, the law recognizes as still water and flowing water. Still water is, the term used is lake, and flowing water, the word used is stream. Of course, stream includes all the river systems and so on. And the principal law here is what's called the State Lands Ordinance. And it says lakes other than artificial works and streams flowing in a natural channel. So obviously, by definition, it excludes artificial works and only looks at the natural work. And then the law in the artificial water bodies, it looks at the reservoirs and the artificial channels which connect the reservoirs. Then there is another definition of what's called a private lake or a stream and a public lake or a stream. So private lake or a stream is that which is situated entirely within private land. Anything other than that becomes a public lake or a stream. And in Sri Lanka, land ownership is such that a large extent of land is state managed. And as a result of which, private lakes or streams are almost non-existent, right? Nothing of significance falls within the private land estate. And the State Lands Ordinance then says that the right to the use and flow and to the management and control of water in any public lake or public stream will vest in the state, right? So clearly the intention is that these public lakes or streams, the water is managed by the state machinery. Then of course, that if you want access to that water, you are required to obtain a permit. This is not very strictly enforced though, even though it's there on paper. And when the State Lands Ordinance came into operation, there were other systems already recognized. Therefore, those had to be, in a way, excluded in the law. So the law, in fact, excludes the irrigation ordinance, the forest ordinance, the land development ordinance, which were already there when the State Lands Ordinance came in 1947. Then rights conferred, exercised under written law is not subject to a permit. A license from the state is not subject to a permit. The rights of a riparian proprietor, of course, there are limitations which say that the riparian proprietor can only extract water through a bucket or something, a manual means, and not through mechanical means here. And any entitlement under written law is also excluded. So the issue here then, when you exclude by such broad terms, then it becomes a matter of case by case finding out, is this an excluded use or is this something that requires a permit? The artificial water bodies are also regulated under two principal laws. The Agrarian Development Act, which looks at what is called minor irrigation works, which is less than 200 acres, and the Irrigation Ordinance, which looks at other works which are greater than 200 acres. So this is we were talking of surface water. When we come to groundwater, there's very little proper regulation of groundwater in Sri Lanka. The Water Resources Board Act, which has a regulation for the purpose of addressing groundwater, but it only looks at large-scale groundwater extraction. And under the National Environmental Act, there's provision where groundwater extraction over a prescribed limit requires an environmental impact assessment. But the issue with, well, the Water Resources Board Act is the law that is supposed to look at groundwater and all water resources. But the way it is drafted today, its role is advisory, right? And it cannot enforce principally. Now it's trying to enforce through the regulation, but mainly the provisions in the law are for the purpose of advising the minister on what actions to take. So you see then that the formal law, in fact, has multiple categories of categorization of water resources. There's obviously surface and groundwater. Then there's public and private. There's still and flowing, natural and artificial, and minor and medium or major artificial works for the purpose of irrigation. If you take the schematic of the laws related to water resources, they are when they came about, or their legacy provisions. So when they were enacted is important. So the oldest of the extant laws on water resources would be the Irrigation Ordinance 1946, but it is built on ordinances which come from the 1980s, from the 1880s, right? So there's reference to the 1917 Irrigation Ordinance and the Ordinance of 1889. Then the State Lands Ordinance, which even though it deals with land, as I already mentioned, it also looks at water resources, particularly those in natural water sources, lakes and streams. Water Resources Board Act 1964 is intended to look at all water resources, but it is largely advisory. The National Water Supply and Drainage Board law came about in 1974 and is the main utility provider for the water sector, domestic and industrial water. Now, if we just take the complexity of this, just to demonstrate the complexity, if I just take water supply as an example, we go right to the bottom, you find the Municipal Council's Ordinance, Urban Council's Ordinance, and what are called the Pradesh Sabhas Act. These are all local authority laws which came about at different times. And all these have water supply provisions. But in 1974 came this National Water Supply and Drainage Board law with provisions to take over the water supply of being carried out by local authorities. But notwithstanding the fact that the National Water Supply and Drainage Board came as a specified organization of state to engage in water supply, the provisions related to water supply in the local authority law still subsist. Right? So there is a little bit of tension there because water supply is one of the principal revenue generation sources for local authorities. So when it is taken away, they lose a large portion of their revenue generation capacity. Mahaveli Authority of Sri Lanka is Mahaveli is the main river in Sri Lanka. And Mahaveli Authority of Sri Lanka was established to address integrated development of areas that can be developed through the Mahaveli River. So that law came with its own regime. And in fact, within the Mahaveli area, the Mahaveli Authority can enforce some of the other water-related laws also. The National Environmental Act is, of course, the umbrella act on environmental protection, including licensing of industrial pollution. Mines and Minerals Act refers to mineral water. Agrarian Development Act we already discussed. The Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka is the main independent regulator for utilities. Water has still not been brought under the Public Utilities Commission, but electricity, which is dependent largely on hydropower, is under the PUCSF. Sustainable energy, there's a large number of sustainable energy sources which are hydropower related. Then electricity, obviously, because of the hydropower aspect, becomes relevant. Farmers' organizations from the irrigation sector is the main stakeholder organizations. These are the irrigation water use, the most prominent irrigation water user associations. And they have their seasonal cultivation meetings where they meet with the government officials. They sit and define the laws that would apply or the rules that would apply for the next cultivation season, which include the cultivation commencement and ending date, water allocation decisions, crop selection, responsibility for maintenance of distributary canals, and so on. And this is, of course, consensus-based decision making. So you will see that the law has, in fact, incorporated some of those earlier traditional systems that I was talking to you about. Right? Those can be seen reflected in the existing law. And as far as private water sources, the limited private water sources are concerned, what is called the residuary law, the term is used, called residuary law, that is particularly on land, water, and so on. When the written law or parliament-made law does not contain provisions, you can fall back on the residuary law, and the residuary law for Sri Lanka is the Roman Dutch law brought to Sri Lanka during Dutch times, right? So those have different concepts which apply where relevant. When we look at the types of formal water rights during our tenure study, we find a large number of concepts that are there in other countries also. Traditional formal water rights, permit-based water rights, de minimis is where the small level, these are the riparian owners' rights to extract water, regulatory licenses, water supply contracts, minimum flow requirements, where development is permitted. There are minimum flow requirements also. And for private water sources, Roman Dutch law, servitudes, contract law, and any statutory restrictions applicable. Informal water rights, there's customary tenure, religious use, informal arrangements, and assumed water rights. And this statement from the regulator, the independent regulator, the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka is important because it talks of the perception of the people. And it says the formal system of water management where water is priced and has assigned rights conflicts with the perception of customary systems that water is a natural and common resource and therefore should be treated as an integral part of the everyday life, culture, and tradition, right? And so one needs to be aware of this perception when looking at how these laws are applied on the ground. The ground reality is complex. Some of the users it's challenging to classify them. And unlike land-based disputes, where you have private ownership and therefore the dispute gets elevated to court, water conflicts are generally resolved through negotiation at a local level. There is potential for issues and conflicts in the future because the laws have developed largely keeping in mind a scenario of water abundance and not scarcity, and with of course climate change coming into play, as well as pollution being a significant factor on finding potable water sources, potential for issues and conflicts arise. And of course, when new large-scale users are introduced, for example, if domestic water supply is introduced to a irrigation reservoir, then there is conflict. So participatory methodology is required to address these situations. There isn't a framework law that can enforce water rights. The Water Resources Board Act, as I said, is advisory. And there needs to be efficient, legally mandated dispute resolution mechanisms, and also dispute resolution versus adjudication, where if you look at adjudication as, one person wins, one person loses, that's not a good model for water resource disputes, obviously. It has to be just and equitable. And again, there needs to be better integration between the formal law and the practice on the ground, because you find that in several areas, practice dictates precedent, right? So whereas the law may not be, that may not be totally consistent with what the law requires or what the law says. And this is my last slide, where the very mobility of water inhibits the applicability of traditional concepts of tenure. And I simplified it to say mine today, yours tomorrow, because the water that is today in my reservoir or my cup can flow into yours tomorrow, and then it becomes yours, right? So therefore, the very mobility, unlike land tenure, we need to develop better different understanding as far as water tenure is concerned. Tenurial arrangements determine how communities and organizations gain access to natural resources. And our definition right now talks of tenure is the relationship legally or customarily defined, right? So the term defined, because we find that sometimes it is beyond definition. It's not even defined at the moment. And then there are others which don't fall into the formal structure of tenure. For example, active versus passive use. If an industry is permitted to discharge into a water body, that's a passive use, right? So then you need to realize that then you need a different dynamic to capture that. And then, of course, the defined versus the undefined, that's what I was talking about before. So this is like a cross-section of what I discovered, the Sri Lankan scenario, as well as what I discovered through the tenurial study in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anand. Thank you for this amazing effort or summarizing a work of over a year. in 15 slides. So thank you so much. I see that there is already some questions in the chat, so I'm gonna read them to you, Anand. So please, how are the non-consumptive uses managed in Sri Lanka, for instance, for fishing in a lake or a stream? Then there's other two more questions, but since this also has been set as a meeting to make it more interactive, colleagues that have questions, thank you for putting these on the chat, but if you want to raise your hand, I will give you the floor later. So please, Anna, if you can.
Yeah, so taking fishing as an example, we as part of the FAO study, we also visited the local area that we selected because of its diversity. And you find when you're talking of the fishing aspect, you find sometimes the formalized fishing as well as the informal fishing, where people simply go out and do their fishing. But there are also organizations, the state recognizes inland fishing. There are institutions set up, the National Aquaculture Development Authority, which regulates the inland fishing activity. And there are farmers of fishing farmers collectives established. And through these, there is an interesting scenario. Sometimes you actually have something like a leasing of the water body for the purpose of doing the fishing activity. So it appears to be subsisting in harmony without much conflict, because as the question was posed, it's a non-consumptive use. But there are other non-consumptive uses which can cause conflict. For example, if you take hydropower, which is also considered a non-consumptive use, but you do extract the water from the reservoir, then you take it through the penstock and then you generate electricity and you then discharge it downriver or downstream. So that even though it is considered non-consumptive, it does deny access to that intervening point from the intake and the discharge. So that then can create some kind of tension between the stakeholders. Yes.
Thank you, Anand. I see another question for Felix, but Felix, I'm going to give you the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Mr. Anand, for a great presentation. I'm from the fisheries department. First of all, I'd like to make a clarification between fishing and aquaculture. Aquaculture is the farming of fish and fishing is the catching of fish. So that is a difference. And I'm mainly concerned about the catching of fish. And in this respect, I would like to know if there are any rules with respect to the connectivity of streams or the flooding patterns and so on. I'm asking because for the capture of fish, you need, for the, well, how you say it, for the growth of fish, these flooding patterns need to be there. Fish also need to be able to migrate up and down a stream. Are there in Sri Lanka, are there any rules in this respect? And one comment, I saw in your discussion with respect to the water management that you were talking mainly about farmers as stakeholders. Are in these discussions, are fishers, so people catching fish, also included, or are they actually just ignored? Thank you.
Yes. So the clearest set of rules on fishing is found in the marine environment, and that is clearly there have been cases, a large number of cases and so on, but that's not what you're talking about. So when we come to the freshwater environment, the formalized engagement of fishing gets incorporated when the farmers do their seasonal cultivation meeting. So those requirements are also, if these are formally recognized, if this is a formally recognized activity, that also gets figured at that meeting, right? And so that's how it comes about. Sometimes it may be that some of these some of these farmers may also be part of the fish farmers collective, but sometimes that's not so. And in some areas, we found that it was actually even different ethnic groups that were engaged in the different activities. But the interests get reflected at this cultivation meetings, and we did not find any conflict areas to that extent between the two users. But whether, as you said, whether flooding patterns are taken into account, I did not come across such examples. I'm assuming that that does come into play, but during the time that we were looking at it, it did not figure. So we did not see such examples.
Thank you, and thank you, Felix, for your questions. Please, for all the participants, please note that we will be happy also to share the full report. If you're interested, please also share us an email and we can share the full report with you. I see that Benjamin has his hand up. Please, Ben, go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Anand, for your great presentation as always. You had a quote by one of the water resources administrators that says that the customary and the formal water tenure arrangements sometimes are in conflict. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit, if you, during the study, could detect such conflicts between customary and formal allocation arrangements, and explain a bit more about how these customary arrangements work in practice. Thank you.
Yes, Benjamin, I think this is the quote that you're referring to, what you see on your screen.
Correct.
Yeah. So I have highlighted the word perception, right? So I'm not saying that there is a conflict in that sense, but their perception is that there is that water is seen as a free resource and with an obligation on the part of the state to provide access to water. And interestingly, if you look at how the irrigation rate is specified or recognized in the irrigation ordinance, it says that a rate may be levied for the purpose of the supply of water and not for the water per se. So then what basically how the law recognizes it is that it is for the infrastructure that you are paying, and not strictly and this is of course old law. This is irrigation ordinance is from the 1940s, but when they structured it at that point, the use is that it is for the supply that you're paying and not on the water per se. So there's no quantification as such, and the payment contingent upon the quantification. Am I clear?
Thank you.
Right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anand. And I remember also, and for information of everyone, was based also on the results of Sri Lanka and Senegal, that we updated the methodology to include this idea of perception of security in the guide, because we realize, thanks to Anand's work, that in Sri Lanka, for example, religious tenure uses as are being perceived in some cases as equally secure as some types of licenses that are recognized by the legal framework. So this idea of the perception of the security by the users is also important to take into consideration on how water tenure lenses allow you to do this as well. So thank you so much, Anand, for your reply. I see also there's a question of Barbara Banghappen, but I don't see her hand up, so I'm just gonna read it out loud. She's asking if just and equitable are further defined.
Yeah, so unlike in land tenure, this is, and I'm trying to draw a distinction between land tenure and water tenure, because land tenure you have somebody who owns the land, and at any point in time there's an owner to the land, and then the adjudication is to find out who's the owner, who has what rights, and so on, what kind of interests there are. And then the person who is denied that title or denied that interest uh, becomes doesn't obviously is the loser. But in water, where water is concerned, being fundamental to livelihood, not just life to life, you cannot have that kind of a scenario, right? So you need a dispute resolution mechanism where you really don't define it in terms of winners and losers, but you look at how the needs can be met, and that's what I was trying to refer to there. So then you actually do come to a different paradigm of interest or recognition of right and interest. Barbara, does that
Thank you so
answer your
much.
question?
Please do. Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, thanks so much for a crystal clear presentation. I was also wondering whether there is a notion of prioritization. The special rapporteur on the human right to water is very clear, exactly as you say, water for life and a higher priority than public interest or economic profit-oriented uses. South Africa also has a similar type of prioritization in which they, legally binding define that what you just said. But I understand that, in Sri Lanka, it hasn't been further defined in that way.
No, it has not.
Okay.
There's no formal document that I can point to and say, here is the prioritization set out here. There isn't.
Okay,
So it's the practice that finally dictates it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you so much, Anand. We're already entering into the debate that is going to bring us together in May for discussing the principles on governance of water tenures, exactly these kind of questions: prioritization, what is equity, participation. Before arriving to the end of this session, there's one last question from Domiti Ballet. So she's asking, how is pollution considered in the customary systems, and is there any obligation to maintain quality of water?
So yeah, that's a very interesting question, because in the customary system, pollution as we know it today, I don't believe existed, right? So in the older, the customary system, those who had access to the water, or those who were in a position to pollute the water, were also part of the system, where they were also users, and they also had an obligation to, if they were to have access to the water, they had an obligation to utilize it in a way that they did not reduce or take away the right to use of the others. But in the present context, the pollution that we are seeing is somewhat different, because you find, I mean, if you take an industry, the industry's water requirement is met through the water utilities provider, but finally the byproduct of it is discharged into a waterway. So it's that nexus is not there. You know? So I don't believe that I have seen answers to today's pollution within the customary system, but maybe I wasn't looking for it. So so if there are, I mean, if there are examples of how it can be incorporated, I also would be interested in knowing. But by and large, I think that the two systems, as far as pollution is concerned, I don't really see a clear nexus. And so the clear example of that's where we are looking at something like the polluter pays principle and so on. And courts have recognized through litigation, there's been some fairly significant cases in Sri Lanka where the higher courts particularly have ingrained this concept of polluter pays principle. But these are, in a way, modern concepts. So whether they actually exist within the traditional system, I have not seen them.
Thank you so much, Anand. Thank you so much, colleagues and friends, for being connected today. Thank you so much for all the new faces. Before finishing and closing the session, I just want to remind you that the videos and the PowerPoint presentations will be available on the website. That the further sessions also will be announced by email. I will invite also all of you to the next sessions. There's going to be a survey also for each session. It will be important for us to hear what you think about this, about the webinar series, but also about this particular session. Please join us for the next case studies on Vietnam and Indonesia. And please also know that this is part, as I mentioned at the beginning, of a higher agenda that is how the Asia and the Pacific region can support the global dialogue on discussing principles based on evidence-based. So all these research will help us think around these principles of equity, prioritization, participation that have come up also today. We'll be launching also a campaign of water tenure champions. So if you or your organization or your research institution have any initiative that you think will be worth sharing, please participate in the call. The winners of the call will be invited to the regional dialogue in May next year. And next year also, for those that want to know more about the water tenure methodology and how to use it, because here you heard the examples of a long process of assessing water tenure. If you want to know more about this, we will be also holding next year a capacity development session just as an on how to use this methodology and how to adapt it to your specific country cases. So with this, thank you again for joining. Please don't forget to share your thoughts in the survey, and we will be happy to see you in the upcoming sessions.